So where was I? So yeah, before about the 80s, everything, all of the images and the text surrounding the murders were seen as strictly religious. The 80s come, the 90s, free sex movements, and we get to this, it sort of swings the other way, and people start discussing how it's exclusively sexual, that these aren't religious images or religious texts, they're just obscenely sexual. Within that faction, there's a bit of a split between who gets sexualized. So mostly it's, for the beginning of the discussion, it's female saints, and we still see that now, that the females are believed to be way more sexualized than the male martyrs. A little bit later, Robert Mills comes out and says that actually the men are sexualized as well, and he writes a couple books and articles about that. So that's starting to come into fruition, but it's still majority women. One of the big holes in this discussion area that I am popping myself into is the fact that men, it seems that only men are the sexualizers. So the women are being sexualized by men and the men are being sexualized by men. There's no concept that female desire exists ever. So we'll touch upon that as we look at a few different case examples coming up. Also throughout my presentation, because I can't touch on all of my saints, I have small pictures of my other saints. So please enjoy those. Okay, so like I said before, my thesis statement is that these images can be both equally, or text can be equally sexual and religious, and the men and women are equally sexualized, and within that, both men and women can feel sexual desire towards these images. So there's a few commonalities you see across all of the images and all of the texts. In the religious faction, you see what's pretty well indicative when you think of a martyr, that they put their duty to Christ above all else. So it doesn't matter their torture or what they're being told or what they're being threatened with, and ultimately that they die, they will never denounce Christ, and that is why they are a martyr. And in the Catholic faith, that's why these stories are shared. They're meant to inspire a life of dedication and piety. Obviously not to this extent, you don't need to endure that just to be a good Christian, but it's sort of an inspirational factor. The images and texts, specifically more in the images, are believed to have intercession properties. So if you were suffering from a certain ailment and you went to a statue or an image of a saint and you prayed in front of that, it's believed that that saint in heaven would intercede on your behalf and speak to God about whatever your issue was. That's also where we run into the idea of patron saints. So the two saints I'm talking about in my presentation are Agatha and Sebastian. Sebastian is the patron saint of plagues. So he's believed that he could help either stop people from getting sick or help people heal during the plague period, which of course in medieval times was super important and had a really big change on the scape of the world and how they saw things. For sexual commonalities, you'll see in the paintings and the text we're looking at, there's unnecessary nudity a lot. And when I say unnecessary nudity, I mean that it's not required for the activity that's happening in the text, or a lot of the time it's never mentioned in the text. Like they're never said to be not clothed, they're never said to be stripped, but in the images they're naked. And it's like, well, where did that come from? And I will explain that. Also, between men and women, there's a different type of torture that they endure. I find that all of the women, both in the text and the images, they experience sexual torture. So they target the objects of femininity and of the ability to carry a child, basically, which is seen as the pinnacle of what it means to be a woman. So that's the genitals, the breasts, things like that. Whereas for men, they sort of target the man as a whole. It's not targeted specifically to one sexual organ or the other. And I believe that's because they're targeting the man's ability to fulfill male stereotypes, such as being a provider, being able to do things, and being a complete and intact man, which is sort of, they target the man as a whole to debilitate that and to remove his sexual prowess as a man as well. So we're going to start with Agatha. It's her there as well. So in the literature, the sources I'm using, is the Golden Legend by Jacobius. I'm saying that right. So that's a compilation that it was written, I always get this wrong, it was written around the 11th century? 13th, my bad, sorry. He compiled all the stories of all the different saints into one book, and they're all about like a page to 3 pages long, and it's huge. There's 2 volumes of all the Catholic saints and their stories and why they became a saint. So I'm looking specifically at martyrs, and the quotes you see here are direct quotes from his description of it. And he didn't write them, obviously, he didn't invent these saints himself. It's sort of what's been said and what's been used in statements and things like that he then compiles. But the artists do look to this when they are creating their images. It's like the holy grail of saint understanding and things like that. So with Agatha, looking at the religious angle on these texts, you'll see, as I described before, that it's just Christ before all else. She endures all things for Christ. She will not give up Christ. She's a very pious and holy woman. If we're looking at the sexual connotations within the text, there's a few things that you'll see across a lot of female martyr saints. So the first is the focus on the virginity. That's a huge thing. It's always mentioned that they're virgins because, again, the idea of sexuality and remaining pure for Christ and rejecting men because of that reason, like rejecting your ability to fulfill your womanly duties because of Christ, shows how high he is on your needs and wants. We also get, in this specific one, a complete picture of that she's immediately sexualized. This is said in the first page, her beauty would satisfy his libido. It's talking about this Roman person who wants to marry Agatha and she's rejecting him. She's so beautiful and immediately she's eroticized by us. The word libido immediately thinks of that. So we're getting that right away. Further along, after she's rejected this man multiple times, he then has her stretched on a rack and tortured, because that's a reasonable response. And during this torture, this stretching, although you may not think about it at first, is actually sort of a metaphor for the fact that he wants to have sex with her, but he can't, and she's a virgin, so the stretching is similar to the stretching of the body that she would endure during sex. So there's a lot of undertones of sexuality and overtones. It can be pretty overt as well, that you can see in many of the murder stories, but that's just a couple. I could go into all of them, but we do not have time for that. Okay, so now moving along into images. This is the Martyrdom of Saint Agatha by Del Piombo. It was created in 1520. So I'll talk about what I see as religious aspects, and I'll talk about what I see as sexual aspects as well. So religious, like I said before, these images are created for the purpose of intercession to honor the saint. So showing this part where she's enduring the most pain of her entire torture just really shows how dedicated she was. The fact that she would lose her breasts, because that's what's about to happen here, for Christ, losing her idea of femininity, her womanhood, and just experiencing a lot of pain. That's that dedication that is appreciated and sort of idolized by the faith. So yeah, if this image was hanging, it could be used as an intercession purpose. Agatha is actually the patron saint of breast cancer because of her story. So let's say you were suffering from breast cancer and you went and prayed in front of this image, you would believe that could help you, and she would intercede on your behalf. Okay, for the religious purposes, well, there's some obvious ones right off the bat. She's half naked. That's never described in the story that she's stripped. I can't really tell if this is supposed to be part of a dress, but to me it looks more like a sheet, which then why would you strip her and then half cover her in a sheet? Like these things, they don't really make a lot of sense. I understand if you're trying to remove the breast, you would then remove the top, but the way the light hits it, your eye immediately goes to how exposed her chest is, and the fact that she's also so large in comparison to the other people in the painting, again, and there's so much torso and so much skin, is really emphasizing sexuality and the exposedness, especially when you think about the story and how she's trying to preserve her modesty the whole time. The fact that they're focusing on this isn't very much aligning with the literature, but it's aligning with sexual desire. Also, it's displaying her breasts as well, which does align with the story, but again, there's sexual connotations of exposed breasts. We're also getting that sexual torture, that targeted sexual torture I talked about earlier, where they're targeting the idea of femininity and motherhood, because if you removed your breast, you could not feed your child, and these were not the days of formula, so that would really inhibit her ability there. What's also really interesting about this image is it works with gaze. So as you can see, she's surrounded by about 6 men, and they're really domineering over her. There's also, like I talked about earlier, with the light and the fact that the men are all dark, we get that our focus goes to her, but then we can see how she's completely surrounded. And the fact that she's being overpowered and the way they look at her you can see sort of a lustful look in their eyes. So even as we may be sexualizing her as we look at her, within the painting she's sexualized by the characters as well. What's also super interesting is most saints are depicted looking either outwards or upwards in sort of like a ecstasy, or they're going upwards, so they're not mentally present on earth, but she's actually looking at one of the guys who's looking at her. So maybe there's a communication of lust. It doesn't seem fleeting in my opinion, so this could be going two ways, but the surrounding of men and the gaze is a really big demonstration of desire and male desire. Here we also don't get a space really for female desire. It doesn't, just with the heavy male presence and the fact that she's overwhelmed and held back by men, that you can see that the idea that that women would desire Agatha in this situation is not something that was believed or thought of when this painting was created. Now we're going to move along to Sebastian. It's him in the corner. So much like Agatha, Sebastian was also a very dedicated Christian man. He actually joined the military so he could travel around and provide solace and help to those who were being persecuted by the Roman army. So obviously he had to work for the Roman army to do this, but he was willing to do it because he could help so many people. One of the textual examples of him being a religious figure was when a light shines from the heaven and warms him in a glow. It's a common idea of acknowledging someone's holiness, is the heavenly light. So, for the sexual faction of this, it's not as overt as Agatha. We're not stripping her and rolling him naked through the streets or trying to remove parts of his body, but he is penetrated frequently, well, multiple times, not frequently, with arrows. That's how he dies. Well, that's how he first dies. He dies twice. It's kind of a long story, but that's part of his martyrdom, is that he's shot with so many arrows that he looks like a porcupine. That's a direct quote. So the obvious euphemism between arrows and penises is very clear. The penetration, especially depending, as I will talk about in the images, where it's located, what we're talking, and what we're seeing. Like I said before, the idea that men were the sole perpetrators of sexualization is a common idea. So when it's being created and when the story was being written, there wouldn't be an idea that he would be sexualized by a female. So it would be sodomy if we were trying to sexualize Sebastian in that way. For now, then I will talk about how it's not. Okay, so this is the Martyrdom of Saint Sebastian by Il Sodoma. It's 1525, so just after our last one. I'm going to talk about how it's religious first, because that's very good as well. So we get Sebastian. This is his martyrdom. Part of his martyrdom is one of the more painful parts of his martyrdom. He's being visited by an angel who's actually carrying the martyrdom crown. So martyrs, when they achieve their martyr status, are bestowed with this crown to symbolize that. And you can see it through art quite frequently. This part isn't really talked about in the story. It's just an artistic interpretation, but you can tell he included it to emphasize the martyr factor and the fact that he's with angels. The fact that Sebastian's also looking up in that ecstasy that was missing from Agatha's story, Agatha's image. So that again is a symbol of holy ascension, as well as the light. We get the light again with him. This isn't the light that was described in the story, because that happened earlier, but this is just another artistic interpretation. You can also see the parallel with Christ's depictions, the fact that they both wear the loincloth and have an open chest. That could be religiously indicative. I also see it as sexually indicative. But those are my thoughts. For sexual purposes, so we deal with men. It can be a little more difficult for people to see, especially because we're so used to seeing sexualized images of women that we can pick it up really quickly, but with men it's a little bit harder, so just bear with me. He has an idealized form, so a lot of the time, especially in the Renaissance, when they're creating a man, they give him like huge muscles and he's long and tall and he's flowing hair, so we see all those symbols of beauty within Sebastian. Sebastian, despite what people think, was never described as being the most beautiful man ever, but he's actually one of the saints that is depicted more beautiful than any other, even a lot of the women. Sebastian is always depicted in the highest level of beauty, which is really interesting. So we get that. We also again get the small covering of his genitals. There's never any discussion in the text that says that he shouldn't be, that he's stripped at all. I mean, it makes sense to take his armor off if you're going to stab him with arrows, but why would you take all of his clothes off, right? It's sort of that, like, why is this happening? And there's that intrinsic eroticization when you have nudity of any kind, especially that small level of covering. And this, a lot of the Sebastian images have even less, so it's something different to talk about. His position as well is sort of, it's not only open to the audience because it's, I don't want to say it's casual because he's being killed, but there's something like inviting about it, and the fact that he's mirrored by the tree, you wouldn't normally think of a tree as another sexual being, but it creates sort of an image of partnership and like coital connection because he mirrors him so well. And the fact that the torques of the tree and the torques of the body go together, it's very animalistic and sexual. And then obviously the arrows. Different depictions of Sebastian have different amount of arrows. This one, I believe, has 3. So there's one on the ribs, one on the neck, and one on the thigh. Again, the one on the thigh is really drawing attention to the center of the body and the genitals, and we're getting that same parallel with the idea of penetration and what that means sexually. There's actually, for this one, you may know or not, but Sebastian is a huge gay icon. It's very big in the gay scene and for gay religious people to have Sebastian images. So in modern day, there's definitely a concept of him being eroticized by men. And if you believe that the artist who made this was also eroticizing him as I do, then you can see that it was popular back then in the 16th century as well. But there's also a story, and it's not with this image, because the original image is lost, that there was a beautiful depiction of Sebastian, and it was hung, and they actually had to remove it, because the women who came to look at it were so overcome with lust for how beautiful Sebastian was that they couldn't contain themselves and focus on the prayer. This is discussed in Vasari. So they had to move it. So they're right there, and even in that story, which is written in contemporary time with the paintings, there's an acknowledgement of female lust, which is super interesting because they know it's there, but are they painting for that purpose? We're not sure. Or are they painting for their own sexual purpose? So there's definitely